You're about to be arrested. Your girlfriend made the call. The freezing stranger's voice cut through the howling wind. Mariano Colombo stood on the threshold of his snow-covered estate, the gate to his sanctuary. For 15 years he had ruled the Colombo syndicate with an iron fist, his name whispered in fear across the coast. But tonight the biting cold matched a new hollow sensation in his chest. His jaw tightened as he looked down at the young woman in the worn green jacket, snow matted in her hair. She looked desperate, her hands raised as if shielding herself from his notorious temper. "Don't go inside, Mariano," she urged, her eyes wide and frantic. Before he could respond, Lionella Pisani stepped out onto the distant porch, looking radiant even in the dim light. She began walking toward them, but stopped abruptly near a police cruiser at the edge of the drive. She held her phone to her ear, her expression calm, detached, composed in a way that didn't match the chaos of the night. "Mariano, darling, come away from her," Lionella called out, her voice smooth but lacking its usual warmth. "She's just a vagrant looking for trouble." But the stranger, Kayla, didn't flinch. Her gaze remained locked on Mariano's with a disturbing certainty. "Look at the lights, Mariano. Look at her." Mariano's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He looked back at the blonde woman he had loved, then at the girl in the snow. For the first time in his life, Mariano Colombo, a man who lived by the rule of total silence, found himself trusting the word of a freezing stranger over the woman in his own bed. The silence of the estate was broken only by the rhythmic, distorted crunch of snow beneath Kayla's boots as she stepped closer to Mariano, her breath hitching in the frigid air. Mariano's gaze remained fixed on the girl, his mind a chaotic storm that rivaled the whiteout swirling around them. He wanted to dismiss her, to reach for the heavy, gold-embossed door handle of his home and return to the warmth of his sanctuary. But the conviction in Kayla's eyes acted like a physical barrier. He shifted his focus toward the porch. Lionella stood there, framed by the amber glow of the entryway, looking like the personification of the peace he thought he had finally earned. She was a vision in her cream-colored cashmere wrap, her blonde hair catching the light like spun silk. She looked back at him, raising a hand in a delicate wave, but she didn't step into the cold to greet him. She stayed near the door, and as she brought her phone to her ear, her eyes flickered toward the perimeter of the property. Then he saw it. It was subtle at first, a rhythmic pulse of light catching the crystalline edges of the falling flakes. To anyone else, it might have been the festive glow of holiday decorations from a neighboring estate, but Mariano's eyes were trained to recognize the specific strobe-like flicker of law enforcement. Red, blue, red, blue. The colors bled into the pristine white of the snow, turning the driveway into a macabre canvas of impending doom. "They're in the tree line, Mariano," Kayla whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and urgency. "They aren't moving yet because they're waiting for you to cross the threshold. Once you're inside, the exits are sealed." Mariano felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter air. He looked at Lionella again. She wasn't looking at him with love. She was watching him with the clinical precision of a hunter tracking prey. She adjusted her phone, her lips moving in a steady, calm cadence. She was giving a status report. She was the anchor for the fleet of cruisers now cutting their engines and gliding into position behind the heavy iron gates. The betrayal hit him with the force of a physical blow to the solar plexus. For 2 years he had shared his bed, his secrets, and the inner sanctum of the Colombo legacy with this woman. He had believed her to be his soft place to land in a hard world. Instead, she was the blade he hadn't seen coming. The realization shattered his world in an instant. The safe haven he had built was nothing more than a high-end cage, and the woman he adored was the one holding the key. His jaw tightened, the ink on his neck pulsing as the blood hammered through his veins. He looked back at Kayla, the shivering stranger who had risked everything to stand in the path of a man society called a monster. The police lights were growing brighter, the reflection in the snow turning the world into a blurring of sirens and shadows. He had seconds to decide. If he stayed, his life ended in a cell. If he ran, he was a ghost. With one final lingering look at the woman on the porch who had traded his soul for a badge, Mariano turned his back on his empire and followed the girl into the dark. The cold didn't just bite, it consumed. As Mariano and Kayla plunged into the dense thicket of pines bordering the estate, the wind screamed through the needles, a jagged choir that masked the sound of their frantic movement. Behind them, the rhythmic pulse of red and blue light began to swell, casting long eerie shadows that danced like ghosts against the white bark of the birch trees. Mariano didn't look back. Every instinct that had kept him alive in the underworld was screaming at him that the perimeter was closing, a ring of steel tightening around his throat. Kayla stumbled, her boots sinking deep into a hidden snowdrift. Mariano's large tattooed hand shot out, catching her by the arm with a grip that was surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He hauled her up, his eyes scanning the dark horizon. He knew these woods. He had bought this land specifically for its isolation, but he had never imagined he would be navigating it as a fugitive from his own life. "Stay low," he rasped, the command cutting through the roar of the storm. A sudden flash of a high-powered searchlight swept across the canopy above them, a finger of artificial noon searching for a crack in the darkness. They froze, pressed against the frozen earth and the rough, biting bark of an ancient oak. Mariano shielded Kayla with his heavy black coat, his heart thundering against her shoulder. Through the curtain of falling snow, he saw them, a line of tactical officers in dark gear, their silhouettes stark against the distant glow of the estate. They were moving in a disciplined sweep, the crunch of their boots synchronized and terrifying. One officer paused not 30 feet from their hiding spot, the beam of his flashlight dancing mere inches from Mariano's boots. In that moment, the world narrowed down to the sound of Kayla's shallow, terrified breathing and the smell of ozone and wet wool. Mariano's hand instinctively reached for the waistband of his trousers, searching for a weapon he hadn't had time to grab. He was defenseless, stripped of his power, reduced to nothing more than a man in the shadows. The officer's radio crackled, a burst of static that felt like a gunshot in the silence. "Alpha Team, Sector 4 clear." Moving toward the ravine. The beam moved on. As the squad shifted their focus toward the lower valley, Mariano tapped Kayla on the shoulder. They moved like wraiths, staying within the deepest shadows where the snow was thickest. He led her toward the jagged line of the ravine, a treacherous descent that would lead them away from the main roads and into the unmonitored heart of the forest. The descent was a blur of sliding shale and tearing branches, the physical pain of the trek a welcome distraction from the mental agony of Lionella's face. By the time they reached the bottom of the gorge, the lights of the estate had faded into a dull, vengeful glow against the clouds. They were out of the immediate net, but the sanctuary was gone. Mariano looked at the shivering girl beside him, her face pale and rimmed with frost. He was a ghost now, and she was the only one who knew he was still haunting the living. The safe house was a drab, windowless apartment tucked behind a laundromat in the city's forgotten industrial district, miles away from the gilded cage Mariano had once called home. The air inside was stale, smelling of dust and old copper, but it was dry. As the door clicked shut behind them, the adrenaline that had fueled their flight through the snow began to ebb, replaced by a hollow, gnawing ache. Mariano didn't speak. He moved with the mechanical efficiency of a soldier on a battlefield. He directed Kayla toward a small space heater and then moved to a nondescript floorboard beneath a heavy oak desk. He pulled a ruggedized laptop from the hidden compartment, the screen's blue light casting a ghostly pallor over his features. His fingers, calloused and scarred, danced across the keys with a frantic desperation. He wasn't just looking for a way out, he was looking for the why. He bypassed layers of biometric security and dove into the encrypted server that managed his private communications. The digital world was colder than the storm outside. As the files unspooled, Mariano found a hidden partition, a mirrored directory he hadn't authorized. His breath hitched. It was a gold mine of systematic betrayal. There were logs of his private meetings, transcripts of high-level deals, and most damningly, a series of outgoing transmissions titled Task Force Echo. He clicked on the most recent folder. It contained photos of his private ledger, each one time-stamped during the hours he had been asleep, lying next to the woman he thought was his soulmate. Lionella hadn't just been a passenger in his life. She had been an architect of his destruction. He found a series of encrypted chats between her and a handler named Agent Miller. The messages were clinical, devoid of the passion she had mimicked so perfectly in their shared moments. "Subject is becoming complacent," one message read. "He believes the engagement is real. Moving for the final warrant on the 16th. Mariano leaned back, the plastic chair creaking under his weight. The betrayal was absolute. She had used his love, the one vulnerability he had ever allowed himself, as a weapon to dismantle the Colombo legacy piece by piece. She had mapped his escape routes, catalogued his offshore accounts, and even flagged his favorite hiding spots. The estate hadn't been raided by chance. It had been the culmination of a 2-year performance. A small, strangled sound came from the corner of the room. He looked up to see Kayla watching him, her face smudged with soot and exhaustion. She didn't ask what he had found. She could see the truth written in the hardening of his eyes and the tight, grim line of his mouth. "It's all gone, isn't it?" she asked softly. Mariano looked back at the screen, at the digital breadcrumbs of a life that no longer belonged to him. He realized then that Lionella hadn't just taken his empire. She had stolen his ability to trust the world. He reached out and snapped the laptop shut, the sound echoing like a gavel in the small room. The cold truth was that the man he had been died in the snow outside the estate. He was no longer a king, but he was finally starting to see the world with his eyes wide open. The transition from a penthouse to a basement was more than a change in altitude. It was a stripping of the soul. For the first few days in the industrial outskirts, Mariano moved through the world as a phantom. He walked the cracked sidewalks of the city he once owned, his collar turned up against the persistent chill, watching his own face flicker across news monitors in electronics shop windows. The headlines called him a fugitive, a fallen king, but to the people brushing past him on the street, he was just another man in a threadbare coat with eyes too tired for his age. The realization of his true standing hit him in the quiet hours of the afternoon. He had used a burner phone to reach out to 3 men he had enriched over a decade, men who had toasted his health at weddings and sworn blood oaths of loyalty. One had hung up the moment he heard Mariano's voice. Another had offered a hollow apology, claiming his accounts were frozen by the feds. The third had laughed, a cold, jagged sound, and told Mariano that Lionella had already reached out to offer him a seat at the new table. Without the title, without the fear and the payroll, Mariano Colombo did not exist. He was a ghost haunting his own ruins. He sat on a rusted park bench, his breath hitching in the cold air, feeling the weight of 10,000 favors returned with silence. He had built a kingdom on sand, and the tide of Lionella's betrayal had washed it all away. When he returned to the safe house, the smell of cheap instant coffee and damp concrete greeted him. Kayla was there, sitting on the floor near the space heater, trying to dry her damp socks. She looked up as he entered, her wide eyes searching his face for a sign of the man who had walked out an hour ago. She didn't ask for a cut of a hidden fortune or demand to know when she could go home. She simply pushed a steaming mug of tea toward him. "You look like you've seen a spirit," she said softly, her voice the only warm thing in the room. Mariano sat on the edge of the desk, staring at the tea. "I was looking for friends," he admitted, the words tasting like ash. "I found out I never had any. I had employees. I had sycophants. But I was alone the whole time." He looked at Kayla, this stranger who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by standing in the snow that night. She was the only person in the city who wasn't looking at him as a stepping stone or a target. In the eyes of the law and the underworld, he was a monster. In the eyes of his brothers, he was a liability. But to this girl, he was just a man who needed a warning. For the first time, the tight knot of anger in his chest loosened, replaced by a terrifying, fragile sense of gratitude. The ghost of the city was beginning to realize that the life he had lost wasn't worth the soul it had cost him. He took a sip of the tea, the warmth spreading through his fingers, and for the first time in 40 years he didn't feel the need to look at the door. The space heater clicked rhythmically, the only sound in the oppressive quiet of the safe house. Mariano watched the orange glow reflect in Kayla's eyes, his mind still reeling from the silence of his former allies. He leaned forward, the shadows of his neck tattoos shifting like ink in water. "Why?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "You saw the lights. You saw the tattoos. You knew exactly who I was, yet you risked a federal obstruction charge to stand in that snow. Why save a man like me?" Kayla pulled her knees to her chest, her worn green jacket bunching around her shoulders. She didn't look away. "Because I've seen the other side, Mariano. The side that wears the polished badges and the expensive suits. The side that claims to be the law while they're breaking the people they're supposed to protect." She took a shaky breath, the steam from her tea curling around her face. 3 years ago, my father owned a small logistics firm. He was honest, painfully so. Lionella wasn't a girlfriend back then. She was an auditor, working with a state task force. She came into our lives with that same calm, composed smile she had on your porch. She told us she was there to help to root out corruption. Kayla's voice cracked, a jagged edge of old grief cutting through the words. Instead, she planted evidence. She dismantled his business and sent him to prison so her handlers could seize his assets and look like heroes in the evening news. My father died in a cell 6 months later, his heart just giving out. Mariano felt a cold fury igniting in his gut, a different kind of heat than the vengeance he had sought before. He saw the pattern now. Lionella wasn't just an informant. She was a predator who specialized in the lying saint routine, using the mask of justice to commit acts of profound cruelty. I recognized her the second I saw her with you at the gala last month, Kayla continued, her hands tightening around the mug. I've been watching her. I saw her meeting with the same men who destroyed my family. When I heard them talking about the raid, about how they were going to use you as the ultimate trophy to secure their next promotion, I couldn't just sit there. Society calls you the devil, Mariano. But at least you're an honest one. You don't pretend to be anything other than what you are. Lionella and her people. They're the ones who scare me. They kill you with a smile and a warrant. Mariano looked at the girl. A victim of the very system that was currently hunting him. He realized that they were both ghosts created by the same woman's ambition. For the first time, he didn't see Kayla as a lucky break or a random stranger. He was a mirror. He had spent his life building a throne of fear, while Lionella had built a throne of lies. The lying saint doesn't get to win this time, Mariano said, his voice regaining the steady, terrifying resonance of a leader. He reached out, placing his large hand on the floor near her, a silent vow of protection. You chose the devil, Kayla. Now let's see what the devil can do to fix it. The waterfront was a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and skeletal cranes, the air thick with the smell of salt and diesel. A week ago, Mariano would have arrived here with a dozen armored SUVs and a small army. Tonight, he stood alone in the shadow of a crumbling warehouse, his black coat pulled tight against the biting harbor wind. Across the asphalt, a silver sedan glided to a halt. Lionella stepped out, looking every bit the grieving widow in a tailored charcoal suit, her expression a masterclass in feigned concern. Mariano, she breathed, her voice carrying across the empty space. Thank God. You shouldn't have contacted me. They're watching every line. I've been trying to find a way to get you out, to clear your name. Mariano watched her, his jaw set in a hard line. He could see the bulge of a wire beneath her lapel, and he knew that within a 3-block radius, her handlers were closing the net. She was playing her part until the very end, the lying saint, offering a hand that held a dagger. I didn't call you here for an escape, Lionella, Mariano said, his voice echoing with a cold, resonant authority that made her hesitate. I called you here to finish the story. She took a step closer, her eyes searching his for a sign of the man she had manipulated for years. What are you talking about? We have minutes. If you give me the location of the offshore ledgers, I can negotiate a deal. I can save you. Mariano pulled a thick envelope from his coat, but he didn't hand it to her. This isn't the ledgers. And it's not a hit order. He tossed the envelope onto the hood of her car. It's a sworn affidavit from the director of the Port Authority and your lead auditor, Thompson. It's amazing what men will confess when they realize their saintly partner has already set them up to take the fall for a decade of asset seizure fraud. Lionella's composure flickered, a momentary glitch in the mask. She reached for the papers, her fingers trembling slightly as she scanned the lines. It wasn't just a confession. It was a roadmap of her handler's corruption, detailing how they had used Kayla's father as a sacrificial lamb and how they planned to do the same to Mariano. More importantly, it contained absolute proof of Kayla's innocence, documenting the surveillance that showed she was a whistleblower, not an accomplice. You're a fugitive, Mariano, Lionella hissed, her voice dropping the facade of warmth. No one will believe a criminal over a federal agent. They will when the files are already sitting on the desks of the Internal Affairs Division and every major news outlet in the state, Mariano replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. I'm not the monster they're looking for anymore. You and your handlers are. In the distance, the first scream of sirens began to rise, but they weren't coming for the warehouse. They were heading for the district office where the saints were currently being stripped of their badges. Lionella looked at him, her face twisting with a sudden, ugly desperation. She reached for the weapon in her waistband, but Mariano didn't move. He simply looked at her with a profound, quiet pity. The honest devil had won not with a bullet but with the one thing she never expected, the truth. The transition from being a king to a ghost required a final, purifying fire. In the dimly lit sanctuary of the safe house, Mariano sat before a secondary terminal, his fingers moving with a heavy, deliberate rhythm. He wasn't looking for a way to save his empire anymore. He was looking for the most efficient way to dismantle it. For decades, the Colombo name had been synonymous with fear and a vast, intricate web of shadow accounts. Tonight he intended to turn that web into a lifeline for the city he had once bled dry. He began by accessing the offshore ledgers that Lionella had been so desperate to seize. With a few keystrokes he authorized a series of massive, untraceable transfers. He didn't send the money to Swiss accounts or shell corporations. Instead he channeled millions into local clinics, struggling community centers, and scholarship funds for children in the city's poorest districts, the very neighborhoods his business had exploited. It was a chaotic, beautiful redistribution that would be impossible for the authorities to claw back without causing a public relations nightmare. Next he turned his attention to the family records. He opened the encrypted database that held the names of every corrupt official, every compromised dockworker, and every silent partner who had ever taken a Colombo bribe. This was the leverage that had kept him on the throne. One by one he dragged the folders into a shredding protocol. As the progress bars filled and vanished, he felt a phantom weight lifting from his shoulders. He wasn't just erasing data, he was erasing his own power. By destroying the leverage he made himself a man with no value to the underworld. He was no longer a king to be feared or an asset to be bartered. He was becoming a blank slate. Kayla watched him from across the room, the flickering light of the monitor reflecting in her eyes. She saw the sweat on his brow and the grim set of his jaw as he systematically executed the digital suicide of the Mariano Colombo persona. He was burning the throne he had spent a lifetime building, and in its place he was leaving a wake of quiet, anonymous repair. "You're making yourself a target for your own people," she said softly, her voice filled with a new kind of respect. "They won't forgive you for giving it all away." Mariano didn't look up until the final file, a list of his private properties, was donated to a housing trust for the homeless. He snapped the laptop shut, the finality of the sound ringing in the small room. "Let them come," he rasped, his eyes finding hers. "They can't take what I've already given. I spent 40 years being a boss, Kayla. I want to try being a man for the rest of it." The throne was gone, reduced to ash in the digital wind. For the first time in his life, Mariano Colombo had nothing but the clothes on his back and the truth in his heart. He looked at his scarred hands, no longer seeing the tools of a monster, but the hands of someone who might finally be able to build something that wouldn't fall apart in the snow. The transition from the digital world to the physical one came with a violent, shattering grace. Mariano and Kayla were moving through the shadowed corridors of the industrial complex, heading toward a rusted sedan parked 3 blocks away, when the air was suddenly perforated by the high-pitched crack of a suppressed rifle. The bullet missed Mariano's shoulder by an inch, sparking against a metal support beam with a screech that echoed through the hollow belly of the warehouse district. "Down!" Mariano roared, his voice a thunderous return to the command of his past, though his intent was entirely new. He shoved Kayla behind a concrete pillar, his large frame acting as a human shield. From the darkness of a mezzanine across the street, a familiar figure stepped into the dim amber light of a dying street lamp. It was Brandon, his former second-in-command, the man who had seen the family accounts drained to zero and realized his meal ticket had been burned to ash. He wasn't there for the law or for Lionella. He was there for the spite of a man who had lost his fortune and blamed the king who gave it away. "You ruined it, Mariano," Brandon screamed, his voice cracking with a desperate, greedy fury. "You gave it to the rats in the street. You were a god and now you're just a target." Brandon leveled the weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. In that split second the world slowed to a crawl. Mariano looked at Kayla, huddled against the cold stone, her eyes wide with the terror he had spent a lifetime inflicting on others. He realized then that all the money he had donated and all the files he had burned were just symbols. Redemption wasn't found in a ledger. It was found in the marrow of a man's choices. As Brandon fired, Mariano didn't dive for cover. He didn't reach for a weapon. He stepped directly into the line of fire, his broad chest eclipsing Kayla's smaller form. The impact was a dull, hot thud against his ribs, a searing bloom of fire that stole his breath and knocked him backward. He felt the wet warmth of his own blood beginning to soak through his white dress shirt, staining the black wool of his coat. But as he slumped against the pillar, his eyes remained locked on Kayla. He saw her scream his name, her hands reaching out to catch him, and for the first time in his long, violent history, Mariano felt a profound sense of peace. He had taken countless lives for the sake of power, but he had finally offered his own for the sake of a stranger. The distant scream of sirens, real sirens this time, called by a neighborhood watch he had unintentionally funded, sent Brandon scurrying back into the shadows of the docks. Mariano sank to the ground, his back against the cold concrete, the snow beginning to fall again, dusting his dark hair. Kayla was over him in an instant, her hands pressing against the wound, her tears hot against his cooling skin. "Why?" she sobbed, her voice a fragile melody in the dark. "You could have made it." Mariano managed a jagged, bloody smile, his hand reaching up to touch her cheek, leaving a smear of red that looked like a warrior's mark. "Because," he whispered, his voice fading into the wind, "your life was the only thing I had left that was actually worth the price." In the distance, the red and blue lights returned, but they no longer looked like a cage. They looked like the beginning of a story he might actually get to finish. The slush of the late winter had long since surrendered to the persistent warmth of the sun, and the air in the small coastal town was thick with the scent of salt air and blooming jasmine. The biting chill of the mountains, the strobe of police lights, and the metallic tang of betrayal felt like a fever dream belonging to a ghost. Mariano sat on the wooden deck of a modest cottage overlooking the Atlantic, a book resting in his lap rather than a ledger. He was dressed in a simple linen shirt, the sleeve rolled up to reveal tattoos that no longer felt like a warning to the world, but a map of a life he had survived. The bullet wound in his side had healed into a jagged silver scar, a permanent reminder of the night he traded a crown for a conscience. He was no longer Mariano Colombo, the Shadow King of the West Coast. Here, in this quiet sanctuary where no one knew his name, he was simply Mark. He spent his mornings fixing the weathered shingles of the house and his afternoons walking the shoreline, his footprints in the sand the only mark he left on the world. The screen door creaked open and Kayla stepped out carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She looked different now. The hollow desperation that had haunted her eyes in the snow was gone, replaced by a brightness that seemed to mirror the sparkling water. She wore a sundress the color of the spring sky, and her hair, once matted with ice, caught the golden afternoon light. She sat in the chair beside him, her presence a steady, quiet anchor. "The foundation called," she said softly, a smile touching her lips. "The scholarship fund in the old district just reached its goal for the year. Another 50 kids are heading to college because of a silent donor." Mariano took the glass from her, his fingers brushing hers. The touch didn't spark a surge of power or a calculation of loyalty. It brought a simple, grounding peace. "It's a good start," he replied, his voice no longer a rasp of command but a low, contented hum. He looked out at the horizon where the sea met the sky in an endless blue line. For decades, he had believed that peace was something to be bought with blood and maintained with fear. He had been blind to the truth that a man's worth isn't measured by the height of his throne, but by the safety of those he holds dear. Lionella had stolen his past, but in doing so she had inadvertently freed him to have a future. As the sun began to dip toward the water, painting the clouds in hues of violet and gold, Mariano realized he was no longer waiting for the other shoe to drop. He wasn't listening for sirens or watching the shadows for a betrayal. He was just a man sitting in the sun, finally unafraid of the light. The first day of spring had arrived, and for the first time in his life, the monster was truly gone, and the father, the protector, and the friend had taken his place.